Okay, here's our motor back on the engine stand. I'm going to go ahead and flip it over to the side and assemble the counterbalancer, the clutch, the shift mechanism, everything else that has to go on the left hand side. Now we're going to go ahead and reassemble the engine pretty much in the reverse order of the way we took it apart. And we're going to check a few things as we put it back together to make sure it's good to go. First thing we're going to do is reinstall the shift shaft. You can see that there's a bit of rust on the outside of that. We don't want to shove that through the brand new seal, so we're going to go ahead and use a little bit of Scotch-Brite. And we're going to clean that up real good before we push it through. Okay, we got the shaft all cleaned up. That way we know that the seal is going to seal pretty well on it. And if you remember when we took it apart, there was a little tiny spring, which is this little critter right here. That spring has to go from here down to here. So we want to make sure, it doesn't matter which end you hook up first, but you want to hook this up and you want to pull down on it and make sure that the end gets hooked over this shaft or this clip on the end. So when you have it assembled properly, that's going to push on that, and what it's going to do is allow this to spring back and forth. The other thing you're going to want to make sure of is this washer right here has a shoulder on it. That shoulder is made to center this part. So you want to make sure that it sits all the way down, nice and tight against here, and that this can move back and forth freely. Because if it doesn't do that, it's not going to shift properly. We're going to go ahead and set that in the case. We're going to put it over there for right now until we get this part of it assembled. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is put the shift drum back together. If you remember, we took this little tiny pin out of the shift drum. There's two holes in the shift drum. If you try to put it in here, it won't fit. It's too big, which is, again, kind of a nice feature. So we want to go ahead and put it back in this and push it down in. It just goes in finger tight. On the back of this is the opposing location for that hole. So we're going to flip that over. It's got a little shoulder on it that fits inside the bearing. So we're going to sit it down on here. We're simply going to rotate it until the pin lines up. And once the pin lines up, you'll feel it line up. This is the bolt that holds it in. We do not want this bolt to come loose, and you can see from the factory it was simply tightened down, but we're going to make sure that it doesn't come loose later by using some Loctite 271. We're simply going to put a little bit of Loctite 271 on there, and we're going to install it, and we're going to torque it down. If you want to use a torque wrench on that, that bolt is 18 foot-pounds. Alright, so the next piece we're going to put on is this little critter, and this is what keeps it in gear once you make the shift. And if you remember in the previous video, or if you haven't watched the previous video, one of the problems or one of the issues with this particular component is that from the factory, the only thing that holds this in is the lip on the bolt, and that allows this to rock around quite a bit, give you inconsistent shift. So when we put it back together, we're going to install this 6mm washer on top, and that's going to give us more surface area so that the shift detent unit does not wobble. And then we're going to go ahead and put the bolt through there. So now we have the bolt, the washer, we have the shift detent, and then we have its bushing riding in there. Once again, we don't want this to come out, so we're going to put some red Loctite on it. A little bit of red Loctite. We're going to install it the way it came back out. All right, so that's the correct orientation. We can move the shift drum a little bit to make it a little bit easier. So this is going to sit in there. The arm's going to point forward on the motor with the roller all the way in. We're going to go ahead and tighten that bolt down now. Remember, we're using Loctite on here. You don't have to kill this bolt. You don't have to kill any of these bolts. The Loctite's going to hold them in. Just snug them up real good. But one thing you want to check after you've gotten this bolt tightened down, to make sure that this is real free to move back and forth with no restriction. But you can see, because we put that washer in there, there's almost no up and down wiggle to that part. So that's going to work a little bit better for us going forward. All right, now I've got to put the spring on there to provide tension. This is the spring. You can see it's got two little hooks. It doesn't really matter which way it's oriented. Nothing spectacular. What I find the easiest way is to just bring it down and hook it up. Hold on to it. Grab a small punch. A little screwdriver will do this just as well. And you're simply going to pull that over the top of that until it's on. And now the spring will pull the detent back into the shift drum where it needs to go. And that will keep it in gear. Once we have this part assembled, we can go ahead and pick up this. We can rotate it back around, and we can put it right back on over this pin. This pin needs to have the spring on either side, because that spring is going to make this return back to the middle. And we're just simply going to push it down so that this is over those two pins. This is the part that's going to slide back and forth each time you make a shift and make it lock back in. So once this is pushed back down, you're good to go. We're never going to start a motor with a dry transmission, but this is a good opportunity right now to lubricate some of the parts. We can lubricate down there. We can lubricate here. We can go ahead and make sure that the bearings are lubricated here and here. And we can put a little bit here. Every motor that comes from ILR Performance will be fully assembled, and it will go on the dynamometer. It'll be run for 15 minutes to 30 minutes at a minimum for break-in and to check everything out, make sure it works properly. We do fill the transmission full of fluid. We run the correct premix ratio in the jetting when we do the break-in, and then we drain all the transmission out before we ship it, because you can't ship a motor full of oil, or the shipping companies don't like that. However, the transmission will have been fully lubricated before you get the motor back. One of the bearings not to forget, though, is this little guy right up here. That's for the power valve governor gear. So go ahead and give it a little squirt. Doesn't take much, but it doesn't get any lube other than what gets splashed up there over time. So now the bearings are lubed. And while we're here, we're going to put just a little bit of lube in here, because that's a sliding location for the Kickstarter, and it's going to be one of the first things that when you get it at your house you're going to use to get the motor going. Next item is going to be the Kickstarter. This is the Kickstarter mechanism that we took out before. Remember, when we were disassembling it, we went ahead and took the spring off. You don't have to take the spring off to take it out. We just took it off to show you how it comes apart. However, it's important that the spring goes back together properly. You can see that there is a pin or a leg of the spring that comes out here that has to go into this hole down on the bottom. So it's going to be kind of self-explanatory that this has to go into the hole down here. If you were to try and assemble it the wrong way, the holes would never line up. So you're going to take that little pin, and you're going to slide it up, and you're going to put it in that hole. The thing is, this thing has enough room to pop back out of that hole. So what keeps that from happening is this plastic sleeve. And you'll see that this plastic sleeve has a small notch in it that lines up with that wire. So the trick is that when you put this sleeve back on over the top, you need to make sure that it centers on the spring and it nestles over the top of that wire. So when it drops down properly, you can see there's a shoulder right there. The plastic is going to be lower than that shoulder. Remember, there's a washer on that shoulder that we took off the clutch cover. And when you look very carefully down here, you'll see the white part straddles the spring. You want to make sure that the white part is all the way down over the spring. If it sits on top of the spring, the clutch cover is not going to go on. Okay, now the next step is hold your hand on here so that the spring and everything you just put together can't come off. You're going to flip this over and you're going to see this little tab. Well, this little tab has to go behind here. So when you put it together, you're going to have to make sure that this tab is somewhere up in this area when you put it together. And then when you apply the spring tension, this tab will move underneath here. It will pull this mechanism backwards. Sorry. It will pull this mechanism downward, and it will disengage the Kickstarter pawls. So all right. So we're going to make sure that this tab is installed just about here, so that we can get it to drop all the way down in. So as you drop this in and you make sure that this is forward, you're going to find that that works, but the spring is going to be on the outside of the case. So you're simply going to lift up on the spring and you're going to spin the spring around with your thumb, and you're simply going to pop it into that hole. Now everything's put together. You'll be able to rotate this by hand. You just simply squeeze it and rotate it backwards. You're not going to be able to go very far. And you're also going to want to check and make sure that that little white plastic thing is still down behind that shoulder, and that the tab for the spring is still shrouded by the white plastic. If you don't have the white plastic piece in there properly, it's not the end of the world, but you have to have it down in properly in order for the clutch cover to go on. So if you have trouble putting the clutch cover on, can't get it all the way down, chances are that's your problem, that's popped up. In this particular case, you can see it's below the little shoulder that the washer is going to ride on. It's still there, and the spring is in its hole. So that's all put together. Next thing we're going to do is the Kickstarter idler gear. All right, now we're going to talk about circlips. This is a circlip. This is a perfectly round circlip. Sometimes circlips will have two tabs coming up. In fact, there's a couple of them in here that we're going to see that. However, what circlips have in common is they're basically a washer with a groove cut into them, two little holes to get the circlip pliers on, and their purpose is to fit into a groove and hold something on. One of the things that all circlips have in common is that they're stamped out of a piece of sheet stock. When they stamp something out of a piece of sheet stock, it will have a round edge on one side where the stamping went down on it, and when you flip it over to the other side, it'll have a sharp edge. Now, when you push on a circlip, if you were to push on the circlip and the round edge was here, the circlip is going to want to move out of its groove and come over. But when you use the sharp edge will want to stick into the groove and stay. So there's two grooves in here. One is on the bottom of the gear, one's going to go on the top of the gear. The one circlip we do not want to move downwards. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the circlip and we're going to figure out which edge is sharpest. Well, you can see from the factory, this is the area that was up against the shaft before, and when you run your finger on it, you'll realize this is the sharp edge. So that is the edge that goes downward because we don't want the circlip to move that way. So we're going to put a good pair of circlip pliers in here. If I can get them in the hole. And we're going to put that on there. And we're going to set it on there. Okay. Now we know that that circlip is going to stay put where it belongs. We're going to take the Kickstarter idler gear, and the way we know this is the Kickstarter idler gear is there's a bushing in the middle. It's smooth on both sides, but it's flat, it's dished on this side, and it has a little bit of lip on this side. So when we set it down on here, it's going to mesh with the Kickstarter gear. And it's going to be flush. If you were to put this gear on upside down, it wouldn't be flush. You can see that there's a step there. The Kickstarter gear is a couple millimeters higher. So you know that this needs to go that way. It's nice and flush, and there's room for the groove. Now, the circlips are identical, top and bottom. And remember, there's a sharp edge and there's a round edge. In this case, we don't want the circlip to come off this way, so we're going to use the sharp edge up. And we want to make sure the circlip's seated, but yet it can rotate. And now the Kickstarter idler gear can work. So the next thing we're going to do is put the balancer in and the crank gear, and we're going to time the balancer to the crankshaft. This is absolutely critical. I see way too many motors that vibrate badly because nobody timed the gear to the crank properly. The first thing we're going to do is put our balancer in. Haven't done anything with this. This is something that can be disassembled, but it's fairly technical to do. It's not something you need to do during a rebuild. The bearing is replaceable, unlike the Hondas. You can take the two bolts off of here, pull the gear off, change the bearing, put it all back together. But generally, you don't have to worry about it at all. As we noted when we took the motor apart, that balancer is weighted on half, and we need to get it inside here. If we turn it in this way, we hit the case, and won't go in, but when we rotate it this way, there's a mark on the gear here. If we always make sure that that mark is facing towards the center of the crankshaft, everything's going to go together pretty well. And so what we're going to do is line it up with the bearing on the other side, and we're simply going to push it down in, and it goes down in, and it's free to spin. That's all there is to that. There's two tabs that hold the bearing in, these little funky looking critters. You can see the mark in that is the side that went against the bearing. And once again, what you'll notice is this side of it is sharp. This side of it is smooth because it's been stamped. We're simply going to take this and we're going to slip it inward right here. We have one of the 6mm bolts with a little bit of red Loctite on it. You put it in there. Now we have the tab for the bottom. Again, rounded side up, sharp side down. I'm going to line it up right there. And we are going to screw a bolt in. Again, you just snug these down. The Loctite's going to do the job. And what you'll notice is Kawasaki has put a nice little detent right there in the case. They put another little detent right up here. And what that does, it allows the tab to rotate up against the detent, put it in the proper position while you're tightening it down, so you don't have to worry about it spinning around. So drop them in, line them up, snug the bolts down, let the Loctite do its job. Okay, when we took the crankshaft apart, or we took the gear off the end of the crankshaft, we simply pulled the nut off and we disassembled everything. This time we need to make sure that we time everything properly. So we're going to try and get down real close. This is a pretty critical part of reassembly. If you don't get this right, the motor is going to vibrate like crazy. It's going to give you all kinds of grief, and it's never going to run right. All you have to do is line the marks up properly. It's pretty simple, as long as you know what you need to get done. On the crankshaft, there's a series of teeth called splines. And as you rotate the crankshaft around, there's one particular spline, which is right here. You can see these teeth are smooth, straight out. But this particular tooth has a dot right in the middle of it, and it's about 1 millimeter lower than the rest of them. There's actually a step down right there. That is the index mark for the crankshaft. On the counterbalancer, there is also a mark right here. So those marks need to line up when the crank's being assembled and all the gears are being timed properly. However, this is naturally going to fall out of place, but we need to know where that notch is, and we need to know where that is. This particular gear has a mark right there. You can see that little mark right there. You can also see a mark right there. So that mark is going to line up with the balancer. That mark is going to line up with the notch on the crank. So the first thing we're going to do is line the gear up with the notch on the crank. If you need to take a felt pen or something and mark the two, it can be helpful, but there's a mark there. There's a mark there. We now have a mark out here. Now we have to rotate the balancer around until those two marks line up, and then the gear slides down. So right now we have a mark here, we have a mark here, we have a mark here, and we have a mark here. They're all in a straight line. We now have the counterbalancer timed to the crankshaft, so that when the crankshaft goes up, the balancer goes down. When the crank goes down, the balancer goes up. Crank goes back, the balancer goes forward. What it does, it offsets the movement of the crank in every different direction and provides the balance we need. So as long as that mark, that mark, that mark, and that mark are all lined up, you're timed properly. But you can easily see that if you lift this up, you could easily put this together like that. Balancer mark's over here, crank gear's over here. The other thing you can do is, because this is splined exactly the same way, you could literally put this gear on the wrong way and line up the two gears. So you'd have a mark there, and a mark there, but the crank mark is clear over here. So it's really critical that you start out with the crank mark points toward the balancer mark points toward the crank. All right, now we have the mark here, the mark here. Those are the first ones we want to get. Now we have a mark here, mark here. We're just going to wiggle this just a little bit and drop it down on. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're good. This is actually the crankshaft drive gear. This is what drives the clutch basket, which ultimately drives the rest of the motor. It is exactly symmetrical. If you look real close, you'll see a little mark right there. That's actually not a mark. It's the mark from here. It just happens to have transferred over because of the dirt. But this gear doesn't care which way you put it on. It doesn't care in rotation. So simply drop it on there. If you watch the video on the disassembly, you'll remember this washer. This is a spring washer. And you can see the washer is cupped. The inside edge right now is facing upward. The outside edge is facing downward. That's important because you want the downward edge pointing towards the gear. You want the inside edge pointing upward towards the nut. That way when we tighten the nut down, the spring action of the washer is going to put tension on the gear. Again, we're also going to make sure that this doesn't come apart later. So we're going to put some Loctite 271 on here. And then we're going to go ahead and tighten down that gear. This nut, like most things we've talked about, see how it has a sharp edge? And it has a beveled edge. Okay? The sharp edge goes downward, and the bevel edge is upward. We're simply going to tighten this down. We're going to hold on to the rod. That's good. We've compressed the washer all the way down. The nut's tight. The Loctite's going to hold it where it belongs. Alright, we got a Kickstarter that'll turn the Kickstarter idler gear. We got a crankshaft gear and a balancer gear that'll turn the balancer, but nothing's turning the transmission to make the motor go. So right now we're going to put the basket in that's going to connect the crankshaft drive gear to the input shaft of the transmission, and it's also going to connect up the Kickstarter idler gear so that we can kick it over. When we took this apart, we had a sleeve, we had a bearing, and they go inside the clutch basket, and two washers. Those washers are identical, the top one and the bottom one, so it's not terribly critical. But, like everything else, you can see there's a bit of a rounded edge here. You can feel it with your finger, and there's a sharp edge. Okay? When we put this back together, we want the rounded edge to go downward. We're going to put the sleeve on. We're going to put the bearing on. Okay? Now we're going to take the clutch basket, we'll slip it over the bearing, and by wiggling it back and forth carefully, it's now seated on the Kickstarter gear. It's also on the crank gear. The last thing we're going to do, again, this has a round edge and a sharp edge. Sharp edge goes down. So on the bottom, the sharp edge went up. On the top, the sharp edge went down. That's to give the machine surface a good face up against the bearing itself. That's going to allow the clutch basket to rotate. It's also going to allow the transmission to rotate when the clutch is disengaged. Next part is this component. Sometimes it's called the inner clutch basket, sometimes it's called the clutch hub or the inner clutch hub. Bottom line is this is the piece that actually fits over the splines on the transmission. This piece turns the transmission, this piece turns the crankshaft. So without the clutch plates, the crank can turn this, but it doesn't turn the transmission. With the clutch plates in between the two, it turns transmission. This is our lock tab. The lock tab doesn't really care where you put it, other than the lock tab needs to straddle one of these ribs. It doesn't care. You can pick it up, you can move it over here, you can move it over here, doesn't matter, just as long as it's there. Now we're going to go ahead and put the nut on here, and we're going to torque it down, put a little Loctite on it. Alright, we got a little Loctite inside the nut. This nut is beveled on both sides. Doesn't really care which way it goes on. Gently slide it down or screw it on. Then we're going to use the holding tool like we did before. Okay, we're going to use the clutch basket holding tool like we used before, or the clutch hub holding tool, whatever you'd like to call it. Again, like everything else in here, you don't have to kill it. Just snug it up. It's not going anywhere. Clean off the extra Loctite, and then we're going to bend up the tab. You can bend up this tab quite a few different ways. For me, I use this thing as a pair of channel locks. Again, it's not real critical where you do it. Just find a spot on the tab, bend it up, and compress it. And you can see now that tab is up against the nut, and the nut can't loosen up without breaking that tab off. So pretty simple, not much to it. We're going to assemble the clutch plates now. Again, we're going to talk about something we keep talking about over and over. On the steel plates, or there's friction plates and there's metal plates in a clutch. If you look at these plates, they're stamped out of sheet metal. They have a rounded edge and they have a sharp edge. The way this clutch works is the pressure plate on top has to push down against the clutch pack and compress it in order to make it lock up. If the rounded edge faces down, then it moves smoothly. If the sharp edge is facing down, it has a tendency to cock just a little bit and jam on the sharp edge. So you always want to make sure that you take the time to find the rounded edge, the smoother edge. I mean, you can literally run your finger across it and you can feel that this is pretty smooth. You flip it over and this is sharp enough that it wants to try and grab you and cut you. So the sharp edge goes up, the smooth edge always goes down. On factory clutch plates, as you rotate these plates around, you will find a small little notch. That notch is there when they manufacture the plates. It's not a balance point, it's not an alignment point, so it doesn't really matter whether it goes inside, outside, or if they're all aligned. I just because of the way I put things together, I have a preference to line all those up, but these are friction discs. They don't care. So we're going to start out with a friction disc because we have a surface back here that the friction disc rides on. So we're going to take a friction disc, and just because I'm a little anal about stuff, I'm going to put that notch right there in the friction disc, and I'm going to drop it right down. Next thing I'm going to do is take a metal plate, smooth edge, sharp edge. Sharp edge goes up, drop it down. I take another friction disc, I find that little notch, I line it up, I take another metal plate, smooth edge, sharp edge. Sharp edge goes up, and drop it all together, and so on and so forth. And when you are all done assembling those, you should end up with a friction plate. If you end up with a metal plate on top, you're either missing a friction plate or you assembled something incorrectly. But it's friction metal, friction metal, friction metal, friction metal, and it ends with a friction plate. The friction plate is going to ride against the pressure plate that we're going to go put on next, and that's an important piece. Couple things to remember: when we took this apart, there was a washer here. Remember, we talked about this. This washer gets left out an awful lot of times. If this washer gets left out, the clutch doesn't work smoothly and the clutch arm is in the wrong position to operate properly. So make sure that washer is on there. And we're going to take the clutch pressure plate. We're going to take this arm. We're going to slip it up through the bearing so that the notch is on the outside. The other way to do this, it's probably a little bit simpler, is with the washer going up, the notch going up, you can take that and drop it down in there. Then you can take this, and these holes have to line up with these studs. And when you do that, that locks down. This doesn't care on a Kawasaki what the orientation is. It'll work if you put it like that, or if you put it like that. The Yamahas and some of the Hondas, they are position sensitive, but on the Kawasaki, it simply goes on anyway and it sits down in. You should have a little bit of free play here. Now we're ready to put clutch springs on. Next part that needs to go on is the clutch springs. The clutch springs are going to go in here and they're going to provide the pressure on this plate to squeeze the clutch and hold it while the motor provides load. These are factory clutch springs. These are heavy duty springs. The Tecate uses the same clutch plates as a KX500. The only difference between the two is the amount of spring that is provided from the factory in order to compress it under a load. Since this is a 330 big bore kit, we know that the factory springs are going to be pretty marginal, and the fact that they're as old as they are means that they're not as good as they were when they came out of the factory. So we want to provide a little bit more tension. If we go with 6 aftermarket heavy-duty springs like Barnett springs or EVC springs, it's ungodly hard to pull the clutch lever in, and it really doesn't work that much better. So what we do is we utilize 3 of the factory Tecate springs, and we put 3 KX500 springs. You can see the wire diameter in the KX500 spring is a little bit stiffer, plus when you hold the two together, the KX500 spring is a little bit longer, so it has more tension. So what we're going to do is we're going to alternate these. So we're going to put a Tecate spring here, we're going to put one here, and we're going to put one here. And then we're going to put a KX500 spring here, here, and here. So we end up with a stiffer clutch, but not so stiff that it's unbearable to pull in. So we're going to put the Tecate springs on first. So here's our 3 factory Tecate springs. And then we're going to put our 3 KX500 springs. You can see they're a slightly different color because of the heat treat and the fact that these are brand new. These are evenly spaced. These are evenly spaced, so that makes sure that they work properly. If you were to put 2 KX500 here and 2 Tecate here and then 1 of each here, the clutch isn't going to work properly. It's very important that the 3 springs be in a triangle and a triangle. So these 3 pull evenly, these 3 pull evenly. Now we're going to go ahead and put the bolts back on to tighten them back down. Alright, each spring gets threaded in. These are factory Tecate bolts. Do not just put normal bolts in. Like we talked about in the disassembly video, there's a washer underneath this bolt to hold the spring. There's also another washer that indexes the spring. If you were to put an ordinary bolt in there with just the washer and not that washer, you won't properly align the spring, plus you'll put too much preload on the spring and the clutch won't operate properly. So now that we have 6 of those on, we're going to tighten those down until they're snug. All right, we didn't put Loctite on these because they're held by a spring, and we don't want to over tighten these because they're simply going into a cast aluminum threaded boss. If you tighten them down very tight, they're just going to break and you're going to ruin the inner clutch hub or the clutch basket, inner clutch basket or the clutch hub, whatever you want to call it. So they're simply snugged down. You screw them down till they tighten up and stop. So this is free to move. The crank now rotates the clutch basket because it's fully engaged, and that ultimately rotates the transmission. So this side of the motor is all put back together. The next thing we need to do is rebuild the clutch cover. We're going to go through the power valve actuator mechanism, and we're going to go through the water pump and make sure it's in good shape before we drop that cover onto here.